The Sermon on the Mount is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the New Testament for the average person to accept as a code of conduct. From the earliest times when this code was promulgated, it came into direct conflict with the prevailing policies of the time. There has been a great deal of discussion, particularly in the last 50 years, as to the relationship of this code to ancient Judaistic law in a determination or effort to decide whether or not in this code Jesus was speaking on the authority of the elders of Jerusalem or in conflict with this authority. Jewish rabbis today are inclined to feel that this code is also acceptable to the Orthodox Jew, and that therefore it is within the province of a rabbi teaching 2,000 years ago. Therefore we have another acceptance uniting the two principal faiths that are found within the structure of the Holy Bible. Most persons feel that the Sermon on the Mount is simply unlivable. They mostly agree that it would be a wonderful thing if we could live it, that it represents perhaps the highest concept of religious ethics that the world knows. But it is so lofty in its concept and so severe in its statements that the average individual feels that it has to be modified in some way. Perhaps the answer lies in trying to understand the perspective of this sermon in relationship to the people of the time. It is obvious from the opening introductory section that Jesus, having passed into this mountainous place, gathered his disciples around him, and also in the presence of a multitude of persons, delivered this sermon. Incidentally, the original sermon probably did not contain all of the elements now incorporated into it. It was built up from other statements which he made, which have a bearing upon the key thought or substance of the sermon, which is righteousness. There is something, therefore, to suggest that the sermon was directed primarily toward the disciples. Jesus is assumed to have known that these disciples were going forth as lambs among wolves, that they were going to promulgate a doctrine that would bring upon themselves persecution and in most instances martyrdom. It is quite conceivable, therefore, that he gave them certain extremely strict injunctions which they were to follow as examples of the faith which he taught. He seems to have felt that if they did not live this doctrine, they would be unable to influence others to do so. Also in this series of statements, which we call the beatitudes, he protects the disciples in most instances from any reasonable objection that could be raised against them by the pagan world into which they were going. He taught them humility. He taught them to avoid controversy of all kinds. He taught them to stand firm, placing the values of the Spirit above all temporal considerations. If we therefore assume that this code was first intended for those who constituted a small minority group and must protect their destinies against the pressures of criticism and condemnation. If we see this in the pattern, it will help us to understand the sermon perhaps a little more completely. Also, as the world has progressed generation after generation, Christian mysticism has risen to take its place among the great mystical systems of the world. I think the Sermon on the Mount particularly invites our consideration in terms of comparative religion. There are many phases of it, for example, that could not be clarified in terms of Christian orthodoxy. Most of the extremely conservative groups must face a completely literal application of the words of Jesus. To the mystic, however, there is another world, a world of internal value. And it is only in this inner world that man is really free to be himself, to live the things that are closest to his soul. In the inner world of his own consciousness, man can completely Christianize his way of life. He can become entirely dedicated to a code or a creed which might not be socially entirely acceptable. From this point of complete inner dedication and devotion, he may therefore permit his inner life to shine out through a series of quietudes of conduct, which should not in themselves produce any very grave complications in his own affairs. The great mistake has been, probably, and it has been a common mistake in most religions and a prevalent one among early Christian groups, the great mistake has always been to apply the code or the creed primarily to other people first, to demand of other persons a conduct, and to criticize or condemn them for lack of ability to live up to such a credo. If, however, instead of trying to impress this morality upon our neighbor, we apply it first to ourselves, we may then find that much of the general objection, of the public mind at least, is immediately relieved. We do know, and every mystic realizes, that we can live as we please, as an experience of our own consciousness. When we compare the Sermon on the Mount with the revelations of other mystics, not any longer with the Orthodox creeds, but with other mystical beliefs, we discover it far more acceptable, closer to the world concept of man's own inner life. Certainly it is very close to the doctrines of the Sufi, a very harmless group of people. It would certainly be in the spirit of the ancient Essenian teaching, a community with which we have become suddenly much more interested as a result of the Dead Sea Scrolls problem. We also see many parallels between this sermon and Buddhist mysticism, and there's no doubt that a book could be written on Zen and the Sermon on the Mount. These other systems, in their mystical simplicity, come very close to this concept, and we find much of it in the beautiful prose poetry of Kahil Gibran. This mystical point of view, cutting through and transcending the so-called reasonable ways of doing things, reveals also the mystical consummation that man is capable of a degree of insight in which that which seems possible only to his mystical senses can become possible in his full and total life. Another point that I believe is valid in this consideration is the fact that mysticism, by its very development within man, causes certain changes in himself by which all things become possible, and that which to the objective mind is inconceivable can to the subjective not only be conceived but respected, acknowledged, and sustained. A great deal, therefore, depends upon the flow of psychic energy within the person as to whether he is able to face a challenge as great and as positive as the one involved in the sermon of Jesus. There are many different ways in which we can approach this very beautiful sermon. But in this present generation in which we live, there are points that perhaps will help to clarify the basic concept. If man lived in this world a total and complete existence, if man faced an eternity of continuance here in this world alone, if the universe consisted only of those natural laws with which we are acquainted in science, then perhaps the entire problem of the Sermon on the Mount would be beyond us and among the abstractions of possibility. But each individual lives not only in a material world of which he is a citizen for a certain number of years, but he lives in a larger world, a world of consciousness. And about the laws of this world he knows comparatively little. Even today, the researches in psychology have brought us only to certain subjective phases of man's mental and emotional life. We have not yet penetrated through into the spiritual root of man. We do not know actually the rules governing his universal citizenship. We do not know what his relationship to eternity and space and spirit actually are. This relationship or group of relationships must be clarified in some way if we are to meet the challenge of our time. It is quite conceivable and possible, therefore, that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking to us about universal relationships. Relationships which have a bearing upon our universal destiny, and perhaps reminding us, as we sometimes remind ourselves, that our achievements here do not guarantee us an acceptable life in space. That even though we keep all the rules of our existing society, we must in full time depart from this society into another kind of life. In this other kind of life, most of the things we know here are no longer applicable. And whether we regard the possibility of reincarnation or not, it is certain that a great part of our existence is not lived in this kind of a world. And also that regardless even of this factor, the very world we live in now is changing. And if as citizens of space we should return here 1,000 years from now, later 2, 5, 10,000 years from now, that we will come back into a different dimension of life than that which we now know. Perhaps, therefore, in our sermon we are dealing with a universal code that we have not yet learned to experience, but which must come and which must ultimately dominate our way of life. If, therefore, this sermon deals with an eternal nature of ourselves, with patterns of conduct that must ultimately be met if we are ever to have peace, security, and goodwill among men, then it is certainly valuable for us to think about these things as deeply and as honestly and as sincerely as we can. I believe that, in a sense, we get certain consolation from some of the Eastern philosophies relating to this problem. These philosophies are willing to admit that at this time man probably cannot live according to the fullness of any spiritual revelation. He does, however, possess the internal power to know that such revelation exists. He also has the internal integrity which causes him to hope, to wish, and to feel that this inner revelation is right, even though he cannot fully meet its challenge. I'm inclined, therefore, to feel that the most important practical thing for us to do is to move in the direction of the grand concept of this sermon, admitting, even as we progress, that we will not be perfect in the fulfillment of these various rules. Perhaps, therefore, in a Socratic sense, we must first seek moderation. We must depart from such excess as we can gradually overcome in our own natures. We must come nearer and nearer to the value that we know to be right. We will occasionally fail. In some matters we may fail more than occasionally. But still, if we sincerely endeavor, we will discover that even a small achievement brings a marked and measurable result. If we are able to control ourselves even to a degree, the life we live and our association with other persons will be ennobled and enriched. Thus, perhaps, instead of taking the attitude that it must be all or nothing, we should take the attitude of recognizing the need of growing up in a spiritual consciousness, moving step by step away from those values which we know are not right to those values which we know are right, and keeping ever clear in consciousness the vision of that which is ultimately right. Thus, by degrees, through the modification of conduct, we are able to attain greater and greater internal integration. We have already learned from psychology that merely battling with fixations and complexes will not end our psychic problem. That there is no use seeking a temporary adjustment. It may, of course, have certain immediate helpfulness, but it is not solutional. The only solutional thing that can happen to us is that we grow gradually toward the truth that we know is right. And as we grow, perhaps gradually, naturally, and without too much pressure and tension, we do achieve, by degrees, these ends which we know to be necessary. Also, by natural processes of growth, we not only decrease the negative factors of the personality, but we also gain further strength from within ourselves to advance this growth. Perhaps at the beginning we have very little strength and a great deal of obstacle. But as we proceed, strength increases and obstacle decreases. So it is necessary to make some beginning. And certainly in the Sermon on the Mount, we have wonderful suggestions as to how this beginning can be made. And in the particular summary, of course, of the Beatitudes, we have a very clear creed of attitudes that are right. And most of these attitudes do appeal to us. And most of these attitudes would be, in the end, the kind that would bring us to quietude. The whole purpose, it seems to me, of this sermon is to help the individual to remove from his experience the disorder, the discontent, and the inconsistency, which together lead to trouble. Several books have been written by mystics and modern religionists pointing out the importance of the Sermon on the Mount as a psychotherapeutic document. It is admitted that if man had this attitude within himself, sickness would be less common. The problems of daily existence would be less severe, and the tribulations and miseries which seem to flow in upon us would be less numerous. Actually, the internal integration of the person is his only strength against the pressure and confusion of the outside world. And in the type of situation that has arisen in the last few years of world experience, we have begun to recognize again that each individual must make his own private peace with reality. We can no longer assume that we can move along with great concourses of persons to some grand religious end. Such motion as there is in the collective must be due to the stressful effort of the individual. It is therefore a very important thing today to conceive of how we would act if we were in a fallout shelter under bombardment. We hope we never will be. But if this world as we know it was rocking around us, if our own futures could be measured maybe only in hours or days, with what security of inner life would we meet this? Such security must be our basis of religion. It must be a religion based upon some deep, sympathetic rapport with universal values that cannot be destroyed by man's inhumanity to man. We need this inner integration. The only way that we can possibly attain it is through increasing thoughtfulness within ourselves, a renewed determination to have in our own lives a faith that is stronger than emergency. Many persons believe they have this. Some do not believe. Some who believe they have it probably do not. Some who do not believe they have it probably do, under the pressure of situation. Individuals whom we might not immediately regard as religious may face these emergencies better than we do. But whatever be the level of the person, it is certainly some strong internal conviction that must carry him through the emergency of the day. Now we come to think of something such as a possible nuclear war as a unique disaster. It is unique probably in the number of persons who would be involved, but it is not unique in terms of the disaster in the life of each individual, because his own problems are always his disaster. And it is not possible to say that there is a great difference between an individual who is destroyed by nuclear fission or an individual who is destroyed on the freeway by a careless driver. Both persons make their departure from this way of life. Each must face the same transition, whether it occurs to himself alone at that moment or whether it occurs to millions of persons simultaneously. Each person must face this mystery alone, supported and sustained only by his own resources. I believe the Sermon on the Mount is concerned with this mystery of meeting the inevitable, meeting that which changes instantly our entire outlook toward value, meeting an emergency in which what we have becomes meaningless and what we are becomes all meaningful. And in that kind of an emergency, and we must all face it, whether there be war or no war, or whether there be revolutions or no revolutions, we must each face the transition from a familiar way of life with its own peculiar little world and that great way of life, which is the motion of consciousness itself in the infinite. Jesus tries to give us this understanding in the creation of his two worlds, the world which belongs to Caesar and the world which belongs to God. And he clearly tells us that we must render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but we must reserve for God those things which belong to God. A certain part of our outer life here certainly belongs to Caesar, but our inner life, the eternity of consciousness in our own souls, belongs to God, always has and always will. Therefore, we have two codes we must live by. And if we must in some way decide that we cannot reconcile these two codes, then we must try the best we can to cling to that code which is the more important. And there seems to be no reasonable question that the most important code in all the world is that which will cause us to cling to truth, cling to reality, and be acceptable in the light of that divine power which is our source and substance. So in the principle of things, it is not perhaps as difficult as it is in the application. Also, we are concerned to some degree with wording. We are not sure entirely to what degree the wording contained in this sermon is the familiar wording with which we associate terms today. I looked over the New Bible. A little later we're going to give a discussion of it in this next group of lectures, to see whether out of this new translation, a new thoughtfulness, we have come to any better wordings on some of these situations. I do not think that we have. I think that the wordings as given in the King James Version are about as near to the original as we will get. We can be more literal. We can perhaps use more contemporary wording, but I am not certain that we add anything to the substance of meaning. I'm not sure that it is too important to us whether we refer to the mote in the eye of our neighbor and the beam in our own eye, or whether we follow the less imaginative version of the new edition and refer to the beam in our eye as a timber. I'm not sure that this adds anything to the essential value of the situation. Perhaps the timber suggests something to the contemporary woodsman or something, but I do not believe that it adds any clarity to our problem. Now, because some of the statements seem so starkly difficult, I want to discuss a few of them with you to see what we can do to clarify some of these problems. Beginning, therefore, with the section on the Beatitudes, we can say this as the first of them: Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I think the answer to this poverty of spirit does certainly not in mind that we are to be impoverished spiritually. Certainly the individual who has weakness in his spiritual nature is not going to be especially blessed. I think we have to go back to the Old Testament and to a number of the earlier writings to find out when the Queen of Sheba came into the presence of Solomon. His grandeur was so great that it was written that she no longer had any spirit in her. I think by this we simply mean a sense of being overawed by a sublimity or a greatness which, assailing the roots of our own ego-centered spirit, destroys it or takes away not spirit as we know it, but the sense of self-sufficiency, the sense of being actually proud in a subtle way on spiritual matters. I think, therefore, that the sense here in which the poor of spirit is meant signifies that we are no longer rich in our own conceits. I believe this is the spirit or thought that lies underneath it. We are so often moved by ambitions, by the sense of tremendous urgencies in our own nature, by pride, and by a selfness in ourselves, which is strongly opposed in Buddhism, for example. This sense of ego, this ego-ness, which causes us all to feel that we are right, and to mistake self-will for divine will. The individual who feels himself to be completely sufficient, without the presence of God or Spirit in his own life, would, I suspect, be the one who would be rich in spirit in the sense that it is used here as an undesirable situation. It is, I believe, rich in egoism, and that what we are really dealing with is the person who feels that his own abilities are equal to every emergency, and that therefore does not at any time sense the need within himself of a certain receptivity to universals. If man goes along blundering his way through life, he comes perhaps to the sense in the end that he is a kind of animal fighting for existence in a jungle. This type of attitude would, I suspect, be the thing which Jesus is attacking. He is telling us that the beginning of our ability to experience the kingdom of heaven is a kind of acceptance. Not my will, but thine be done. That my will represents a kind of spiritual pride, and thy will, referring to God's will, represents a certain modesty, a certain admission that we are all poor in the presence of Spirit, that we have a dependency upon life, that life is not a richness in ourselves, but a richness in God, and that we must to a certain measure have dependency upon this, and that self-pride, like all forms of pride, cometh before a fall. So I believe that what is meant here in the poor of spirit is freedom from self-pride and self-sufficiency. Every mystic knows this, but it of course is freedom from the self that is spelt with a small s. It is freedom from the ego self. It is not freedom from the divine self, but it is a turning away from this sufficiency based upon our relationship with external things, to a humble or less aggressive attitude, one of receptivity and acceptance, in which we become aware that we are all together mutually dependent upon one life, that this one life alone is real, that it is not a wealth that belongs to us, but we belong to it, that it should not be a source of pride in us, because all life shares it together, and that recognizing that we are gradually overcoming self-will, that we are gaining a different dimension, a dimension of acceptance of divine will, which makes us naturally humble. Humble without being, in any sense of the word, abased by it, but rather humble with gratitude, with acceptance, and with the realization that all we are, we owe to a life beyond our human personal life. I believe this is the type of thinking that underlies the verse, and most mystics who have worked with this subject are of that mind. Another one here that I think is interesting because it is so difficult for us to understand is, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. I believe this verse is perhaps one of the most difficult, because I do not believe that we could assume that heaven wants us to mourn. or wishes us to be sorrowful. I don't think that the purpose of the verse is therefore in the area of its first and apparent statement, but in something that is deeper than this.